The gas station sat at the edge of nowhere, a flickering neon sign casting uneasy shadows on the cracked asphalt below. Travelers called it the last stop, not just because it was the only station for miles, but because something about it felt final, like crossing a line into a place you weren't meant to go. Natalie pulled in, her car running on fumes. She'd been driving for hours, desperate to put distance between her and the suffocating life she'd left behind. As she stepped out, the smell hit her first, an acrid mix of gasoline, mildew, and something metallic. The night was unusually quiet, no crickets, no wind, just the hum of the flickering sign and the faint gurgle of liquid trickling somewhere unseen. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed, casting an unnatural pallor over everything. Shelves were half-stocked with dusty, outdated products, cans of food with faded labels, candy bars that looked ancient. A lone clerk stood behind the counter, his face obscured by shadows despite the harsh lighting. His eyes glinted when Natalie approached, a glimmer that felt more animal than human. "Pump 2, she said, her voice wavering slightly. The clerk didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, his lips curling into a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure thing," he finally said, his voice low and gravelly. He slid a key across the counter, attached to a grimy wooden block. "Bathroom's out back if you need it. Door sticks sometimes, though." Natalie hadn't asked about the bathroom, but now that he mentioned it, the thought of using one gnawed at her. She felt the weight of his gaze as she exited the store and headed to the back. The restroom door was as filthy as she expected, rust streaking the handle. She pushed it open and gagged. The smell inside was unbearable, a cloying mixture of rot and chemicals. The single overhead bulb flickered, casting disorienting shadows across the graffiti-covered walls. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. Her breath hitched. She tried the handle. It didn't budge. Her pulse quickened as she pounded on the door. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing unnaturally. The room seemed to warp, the walls subtly bending inward. Then she saw it, a small, dark vent near the floor, dripping with some black, viscous fluid. From within came a wet, dragging sound, as though something was crawling. Natalie's instincts screamed at her to move, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. A pale, slimy hand emerged first, its fingers unnaturally long and jointed. Then a face followed, blank and smooth like stretched wax, save for a gaping mouth lined with teeth too numerous to count. Natalie screamed, yanking at the door handle with all her strength. It finally gave, and she stumbled out into the night air. The clerk was standing by her car now, his head tilted at an odd angle. His face was different somehow, less human. His eyes glinted in the same way as before, but now she understood. There was no soul behind them, only hunger. "You're not supposed to leave," he said, his voice echoing as though it came from deep within the earth. He took a step toward her, and she backed away, heart pounding. "Stay away," she shouted, fumbling for her keys. The clerk chuckled, a guttural sound that made her skin crawl. "They don't like it when you leave unfinished business. You opened the door." Natalie glanced back toward the restroom and saw the creature dragging itself out, its distorted body folding and unfolding in ways that defied nature. The gas station lights flickered violently, plunging everything into brief moments of blackness. When the lights came back, the clerk was gone, and the creature was closer. She jumped into her car, slamming the door just as the thing reached her window. Its face pressed against the glass, leaving streaks of that black fluid. Natalie turned the key, praying the engine would start. It sputtered for an agonizing moment before roaring to life. As she sped away, she looked in the rearview mirror. The gas station seemed farther than it should have been, shrinking impossibly fast. The creature and the clerk stood side by side, their figures blending into the darkness. But then she saw the black fluid dripping from her air vents, and the faint, wet sound of something crawling in the back seat. The old truck stop loomed in the dark, surrounded by miles of barren desert. Its rusted signs squeaked in the wind, barely readable. Raven Creek Fuel. The gas pumps looked ancient, their hoses dangling like dead snakes. Eliza had no choice but to pull in. Her car was stuttering and her fuel gauge was firmly on empty. The place felt wrong. There were no other cars, no sound except the occasional hiss of wind. Yet there was light, bright, too bright, pouring from the windows of the convenience store. She hesitated but reminded herself that the next station was over an hour away. The glass doors slid open as she approached, though no one was there to trigger them. The air inside smelled faintly of decay, masked with astringent cleaner. Rows of shelves stretched into eerie silence, stocked with products that didn't seem right. Candy bars with unfamiliar logos, soda bottles with labels in strange, nonsensical languages. A rack of postcards caught her eye. Each depicted a desolate, burned-out version of the store she now stood in. The clerk appeared from nowhere. One moment the counter was empty, and the next he was there, leaning casually on the register. He was tall and gaunt, his skin ashen, his eyes a pale gray that seemed to glow faintly. He smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too many. "Late night?" he asked, his voice too smooth, too calm. Yeah. Just need to fill up," Eliza replied, forcing a smile. The clerk chuckled softly, the sound more like dry leaves scraping together. "Pump's on, but if you're looking to stretch your legs, we've got a special in the back." Eliza frowned. "Special?" He pointed to a hallway that seemed longer than it should have been, leading to a door with peeling paint and a crooked sign that read, "Lounge. Just a place to relax," he said. The last thing she wanted was to venture further into this bizarre place, but her curiosity overrode her fear. She stepped cautiously into the hallway, her footsteps echoing in an unsettling way. When she reached the door, she paused. Something wet dripped from the ceiling onto her shoulder. She looked up, but there was only darkness above, a void where there should have been tiles. The door creaked open, seemingly on its own. Inside was a small room bathed in flickering red light. A jukebox sat in the corner, playing an old, warped tune she didn't recognize. Booths lined the walls, but they weren't empty. Figures sat slumped in the seats, their backs turned to her. They didn't move, didn't speak. Eliza's gut told her to leave, but she couldn't help but step closer. As she neared one of the booths, she saw the figure's skin, gray, cracked, like clay left to dry too long. Its head turned suddenly, too fast for her to react, and she saw its face, or lack of one. There were no eyes, no mouth, just smooth flesh stretched unnaturally tight. The jukebox screeched, and every head in the room snapped toward her, their featureless faces tilting in unison. Eliza stumbled back, slamming into the wall. Her breathing was ragged, and her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move, bolting for the hallway. The sound of shuffling, dragging footsteps followed her, growing faster and louder. She reached the main store, but the clerk was gone. Outside, her car engine roared to life by itself. The headlights blazed, illuminating the pumps, and she saw them. The figures from the lounge were spilling out of the building, moving unnaturally fast now, their faceless heads swiveling to track her. Eliza threw herself into the car and sped off, her tires screeching against the cracked pavement. As she glanced in the rearview mirror, the gas station lights dimmed and flickered out one by one, leaving the place shrouded in darkness. But the reflection in her mirror wasn't her own face. It was smooth, blank, and featureless. The last thing she heard before her vision went black was the warped, scratchy tune from the jukebox, playing softly from her car's radio. The road stretched endlessly into the night, a narrow ribbon flanked by thick, suffocating woods. Rain hammered against the windshield of David's car, and the faint green glow of the fuel gauge warned him he'd soon be stranded if he didn't stop. Relief washed over him when he spotted the faint outline of a gas station up ahead, its lone light flickering like a dying star. It was called Black Hollow Station. The sign above the pumps hung at an awkward angle, and the building itself looked abandoned. Still, the pumps appeared functional, and David was desperate. As he pulled in, the rain seemed to grow louder, almost deafening. He stepped out, cold water drenching him instantly, and began fumbling with the pump. "Prepay inside," a voice crackled from an ancient intercom, startling him. David glanced toward the store. The windows were grimy, smeared with streaks that might have been dirt or something else. The light inside flickered sporadically, revealing the vague outline of shelves and a counter. Taking a deep breath, he jogged to the door and pushed it open. The bell above the door jingled weakly. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The shelves were stocked with items that looked oddly out of place. Dusty cans of food with no labels, rows of glass bottles filled with murky liquids, and newspapers so yellowed and brittle they seemed decades old. Behind the counter sat a man, or what David assumed was a man. He was hunched over, his head low, a greasy trucker's cap obscuring most of his face. His hands, long and spindly, rested on the counter, and his fingers tapped an uneven rhythm. Pump 4, David said, forcing his voice to sound steady. The man didn't look up. Instead, he slid a small black key across the counter without a word. The key had an unusual weight to it, and the metal was cold, almost unnaturally so. "Bathroom's out back," the man said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. His words seemed to echo, bouncing unnaturally in the tiny room. David hadn't mentioned needing the bathroom, but something in the man's tone made him nod. He exited quickly, eager to be away from the clerk's unsettling presence. The rain had eased slightly, but the air felt heavier now, like the sky was pressing down. The bathroom door was around the corner, its paint peeling in long, jagged strips. David unlocked it and stepped inside. The light buzzed weakly, barely illuminating the cramped, filthy space. The sink was cracked, the mirror above it cloudy with age and grime. The stench was overpowering. As he washed his hands, the mirror began to clear, but not in the way it should have. The condensation faded, revealing something behind him. David froze, his eyes locked on the reflection. A figure stood in the corner, its outline shadowy and indistinct. It didn't move, but he could feel its presence, cold and oppressive. Slowly he turned, but the bathroom was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer now, its face, or what passed for a face, horribly twisted. Its mouth stretched too wide as though it was screaming, but no sound came out. Its eyes, sunken and black, bore into him. The lights flickered and went out. David stumbled out of the bathroom, heart pounding. The gas station loomed in the rain, its windows glowing faintly. Something moved inside. A shadow crossing the light, too large to be the clerk. He reached his car, fumbling with the keys, and looked toward the pumps. A figure was standing by his car, its back turned to him. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, but David knew it was aware of him. He could feel its gaze, even without eyes to see. The car door unlocked with a click, and David threw himself inside, locking the doors and starting the engine. The figure turned slowly, its head tilting unnaturally to the side, and began to move toward him. Its steps were deliberate, each one drawing it closer. As David sped away, his headlights briefly illuminated the gas station. The clerk was standing in the doorway now, joined by several other figures, all staring after him. The rain swallowed them as he drove into the darkness, his pulse racing. But the nightmare wasn't over. In the rearview mirror, he saw movement in the back seat, the faintest outline of a figure, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, and the low hiss of a voice whispering, "You shouldn't have stopped." The highway stretched like a black vein through an endless void of desolation. John had been driving for hours, the hum of his engine the only sound for miles. His GPS had failed him, leaving him hopelessly lost. When a glowing sign appeared in the distance, it felt like salvation. Pine Hollow Gas and Rest, open 24 hours. The station was eerily out of place, nestled in the middle of nowhere. The pumps were old-fashioned, their metal gleaming in the pale light of a single buzzing bulb. A faint mist curled around the edges of the lot, and the air smelled faintly of something sweet but rotting. John parked and stepped out, shivering as an unnatural chill settled over him. The glass doors of the convenience store slid open before he even approached, and warm yellow lights spilled out, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness around him. Inside, the store was impossibly bright. The shelves were neatly stocked, but something about the products felt wrong. The cereal boxes had no brand names, just generic pictures of smiling families. Soda cans bore labels in a language he didn't recognize, their bright colors faded. The meat in the refrigerated section was pale and strangely marbled, wrapped in cloudy plastic. Behind the counter stood a woman with a mannequin-like face, her skin too smooth, her eyes too large and glassy. She smiled at him, but her teeth were too small, like rows of dull needles. "Welcome," she said, her voice unnaturally melodic. "Traveling far?" "Yeah, just passing through," John said, trying to avoid her gaze. He placed a 20 on the counter. "Pump 3. She tilted her head, her movements stiff and mechanical, as if she were trying to mimic something human. "Of course," she said. "Be careful out there. The road can be tricky at night." He nodded, eager to leave her presence, and stepped back into the night. The mist had thickened, wrapping around the station like a shroud. As he pumped gas, a strange sound broke through the silence, a faint scratching like nails dragging along metal. He froze, straining to pinpoint the source. The scratching grew louder, moving closer, circling him. Slowly he turned and saw something in the mist. A shape, low to the ground, its movements jerky and unnatural. It crept closer, and John's breath caught. The thing had too many limbs, its elongated body twisted and malformed. Its skin glistened, slick and pale, and its face, if it could be called that, was a hollow void. The scratching came from its claws as they dragged along the asphalt, and its head tilted unnaturally as if it was studying him. John jumped into his car, slamming the door shut as the creature lunged. Its claws scraped across the driver's side window, leaving deep gouges in the glass. He fumbled with the keys, heart racing, and the engine roared to life just as the thing began to press its body against the car, its movements frantic and hungry. The tires screeched as he sped out of the station, the mist swallowing everything behind him. But as he drove, the road began to change. The lines on the asphalt twisted and split, and the trees along the edges warped into towering, grotesque forms. The headlights caught glimpses of things darting through the trees, shadowy figures with glowing eyes, their faces distorted into expressions of agony. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on itself no matter how far he drove. Then his radio crackled to life. "Where are you going, John?" A voice purred, low and mocking. It was the clerk's voice, but deeper, more guttural. His stomach dropped. He hadn't told her his name. The voice laughed, a distorted, grating sound. "You can't leave. You're ours now." The car's headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. In the brief moments of darkness, John saw them, figures lining the road, their hollow faces and twisted bodies illuminated by the flashes of light. They were waiting for him, their mouths stretching into impossibly wide grins. The car came to a sudden stop, and the mist thickened, pouring into the vehicle through the air vents. It burned his throat and eyes, filling his lungs until he couldn't breathe. As the world faded, the last thing he saw was his reflection in the rearview mirror. His own face, smooth and hollow, with dark, empty voids where his eyes should have been. The road was deserted, a narrow strip of asphalt winding through an endless expanse of fields. The sky above was a blanket of black, devoid of stars. Mia's car coughed and sputtered, the fuel gauge needle sinking steadily into the red. She cursed under her breath, her fingers tight on the wheel. When she spotted the gas station in the distance, relief washed over her. Its neon sign flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the cracked pavement below. Midnight fuel, always open. The pumps were ancient, their paint peeling to reveal rust underneath. The convenience store was dimly lit, its interior obscured by grime-streaked windows. There was something off about the place, but Mia had no choice. She pulled in, parked by the pumps, and stepped out. The cold hit her first, unnatural biting, far too intense for the season. She glanced around, her unease growing. The fields surrounding the station stretched endlessly into the dark, and the silence was oppressive. Even the hum of insects was absent. She approached the store, the glass doors sliding open with a groan. The smell inside was sharp, like old bleach mixed with decay. Shelves stood in neat rows, but their contents were strange. Jars filled with thick black liquid that bubbled faintly, snacks in packaging she didn't recognize, and magazines featuring unfamiliar faces staring out with two wide smiles. The clerk stood behind the counter, motionless. He was pale, unnaturally so, his skin almost translucent. His eyes were sunken, and his lips curved into a fixed grin that didn't match the emptiness in his stare. "Welcome," he said, his voice flat and toneless. "Pump 2, Maya said quickly, slapping a 20 on the counter. The clerk didn't move to take the money. Instead, his grin widened, his teeth unnervingly sharp. "It's been waiting for you," he said, his tone dripping with something cold and alien. "What?" Mia asked, her heart pounding. Before he could answer, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. For a moment, everything was silent, and then the faint sound of scratching echoed through the store. Mia's breath hitched. She turned, her eyes straining in the dark, and caught movement in the aisles. Shadows writhed, shifting unnaturally, their shapes defying logic. Something darted between the shelves, too fast to follow. The light snapped back on, and the store looked as if nothing had changed, except the clerk was gone. "Mia," a voice whispered, low and raspy. She spun around. The voice hadn't come from a specific direction. It seemed to emanate from everywhere, echoing in her ears. "How do you know my name?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The lights flickered again, dimming this time, casting long, warped shadows across the room. One of the jars on the shelf bubbled violently, the black liquid inside roiling and spilling over the sides. Then she saw it. A figure crouched at the end of the aisle, its body impossibly long and thin, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, twin orbs of dim yellow light. It moved slowly, deliberately, its claws clicking on the tiled floor. Mia bolted for the door, but the glass wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, screaming, but the sound seemed to die in the air, swallowed by the oppressive silence. When she turned back, the figure was closer, its body unfurling to its full height. It loomed over her, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. Its mouth opened, revealing a cavern of jagged teeth, and from within came a sound that wasn't human, a low, guttural growl that vibrated in her chest. Desperate, she grabbed a jar from the nearest shelf and hurled it at the creature. The glass shattered, the black liquid splattering across the floor. For a moment, the thing hesitated, its form flickering like a poorly tuned TV. Mia seized the chance. She slammed herself against the door again, and this time it gave, the glass shattering outward. She stumbled into the cold night, her feet slipping on the wet pavement as she sprinted to her car. She didn't look back until she was inside, her hands fumbling to start the engine. The gas station was still, the neon sign flickering weakly, but in the distance, in the shadows of the fields, she saw them, dozens of glowing eyes watching. The car roared to life, and she tore down the road, her pulse racing. But as she drove, the gas station sign appeared ahead of her again, its glow cutting through the darkness. Her heart sank. She hadn't turned. She hadn't doubled back. The road wouldn't let her leave. The rain was relentless, pounding on the roof of Michael's car as he drove down the isolated stretch of road. He hadn't seen another car for miles, and his fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. His GPS had stopped working hours ago, and the headlights barely pierced the dense fog that clung to the asphalt. When the glow of a gas station sign emerged through the mist, relief flooded him. Bright Pines Fuel, open all night. The neon flickered erratically, casting strange, jittering shadows across the station's facade. He pulled into the lot, his tires crunching on the gravel. The gas station looked old, almost forgotten by time. The pumps were rusted, their numbers worn away, and the convenience store windows were covered in streaks of grime. He could just make out the faint hum of fluorescent lights inside. Michael stepped out, his shoes sinking slightly into the wet gravel. The air was unnaturally still, the sound of the rain muffled as if he had stepped into another world. He grabbed the pump handle, only to find it locked. A handwritten sign taped to it read, "Pay inside first." With a sigh, he jogged to the store, water dripping from his jacket as he pushed open the heavy glass door. The interior was starkly lit, the fluorescent bulbs flickering overhead. The shelves were sparsely stocked, and the items seemed strange. Brands he didn't recognize, labels written in languages that didn't look like anything he'd seen before. A row of canned goods caught his eye. They were unlabeled, just plain metal tins. Behind the counter stood a man. His head was slightly tilted, his face shadowed under the brim of a baseball cap. His grin was unsettling, stretched too wide as if it had been carved into his face. "Pump 2, Michael said, pulling out his wallet. The man didn't respond immediately. His pale, watery eyes stared at Michael, unblinking. Finally, in a slow, deliberate motion, he slid a receipt book across the counter. "No cash," the man said, his voice a low rasp. "Sign here." Michael frowned. "Can't I just prepay with cash?" The man's grin widened, impossibly so, and he shook his head. Rules are rules. Reluctantly, Michael picked up the pen attached to the book by a fraying string. The paper felt strange, damp and cold. As he signed his name, he noticed the previous entries. The names were smudged, unreadable, but the dates were unsettling. They stretched back decades, far too long for any receipt book to hold. "Thanks," Michael muttered, sliding the book back. As he turned to leave, the man spoke again. "You can't leave once the lights go out." Michael stopped. "What?" But the man was silent now, staring at him with that fixed, unnatural grin. Michael stepped outside, his pulse quickening. The fog had thickened, and the station's light barely penetrated the surrounding darkness. He filled his tank quickly, the gas pump groaning as if reluctant to work. Then the lights flickered. His head snapped toward the store. The man was no longer behind the counter. The windows were dark, but he swore he saw movement inside, shadows twisting and writhing, shapes that didn't belong. The pump clicked, signaling it was done. Michael yanked the nozzle out, threw it back into its cradle, and jumped into his car. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. As he pulled out of the lot, The station's lights cut out entirely, plunging everything into blackness. For a moment, the world felt silent and endless. Then his headlights illuminated something in the road. A figure stood in the center of the lane, its back to him. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, as though it had been snapped. Michael slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a halt. The figure didn't move. He honked, but it stayed motionless. Then it began to turn, slowly, its movements jerky and wrong. As its face came into view, Michael's stomach dropped. It was the clerk, or at least it had been. Its grin stretched impossibly wide now, splitting its face in two, and its eyes were hollow, black voids. Michael threw the car into reverse, but something slammed into the rear of his vehicle. He spun around, and his blood froze. More figures were emerging from the fog, their shapes twisting and shifting as they moved. They surrounded the car, their hollow eyes locking onto him. The grin on the clerk's face grew even wider, impossibly so, until it was no longer a grin but a grotesque void that seemed to pull in the light around it. The last thing Michael saw before the fog swallowed everything was the gas station's sign flickering back on, its letters rearranged. No escape. The rain came down in icy sheets as Emily's tires hissed against the slick road. Her phone was dead, the GPS had failed hours ago, and she hadn't seen another car or a sign of civilization for miles. When a dim light appeared on the horizon, she felt a flicker of hope. It was a gas station, old and ramshackle, with a single flickering bulb illuminating the lot. The sign above read, "Last stop, open 24 hours." Emily pulled in, her fuel gauge dangerously low. The pumps were ancient, their metal rusted and corroded. The store behind them was even worse, its windows thick with grime, distorting whatever lay inside. She stepped out into the biting wind and approached the pump, but the nozzle was locked. A faded cardboard sign dangled limply, "Pay inside." She hesitated, but the thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere pushed her forward. The door jingled weakly as she entered, the sound swallowed by the heavy, stale air. The interior was dim, illuminated by a handful of flickering fluorescent lights. The shelves were lined with items that didn't make sense. Old-fashioned tins with no labels, jars filled with murky liquids, and dusty bags of snacks whose colors had faded with age. The air smelled faintly of mold, with an undertone of something metallic. Behind the counter stood a man, or what she thought was a man. His skin was grayish, waxy, and pulled tight over his face. His eyes were cloudy, unblinking, and his mouth was fixed in a small, almost apologetic smile. "Pump 4, Emily said, sliding a 20 across the counter. The man didn't move to take the money. Instead, he tilted his head, the smile never wavering. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Emily blinked. "What are you talking about? I just need gas." The man's smile widened, stretching unnaturally, the corners of his mouth splitting like old leather. "You'll see." Before she could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a faint sound, a shuffling, dragging noise came from somewhere deep in the store. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The lights flickered back on, and she was alone. The man behind the counter was gone, and the door to the back room was slightly ajar, a faint red glow spilling out. She backed toward the exit, her heart racing. But when she reached for the door handle, it wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, but it was as if the door had fused to the frame. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by a wet, gurgling noise. Emily turned, her eyes darting toward the back room. Something moved in the doorway, a shadow too tall and too wide to belong to any person. Its limbs were grotesquely long, bending in ways that defied nature. It stepped into the room, and Emily's stomach churned. The thing was stitched together, a patchwork of flesh and bone. Its face was a jagged mess, multiple mouths opening and closing in silent screams, and its eyes, or the black pits where eyes should have been, locked onto her. She stumbled back, her hand brushing against one of the shelves. Cans clattered to the floor, the sound echoing unnaturally. The creature lunged, its movements jerky but terrifyingly fast. Emily ducked, sprinting down the nearest aisle. She knocked over shelves as she ran, creating a makeshift barrier. The lights flickered again, casting the store in strobe-like flashes. In each burst of light, the creature was closer. its mouths gnashing hungrily, its clawed hands reaching for her. She spotted a fire exit at the back of the store and bolted for it. The door gave way with a screech, and she stumbled out into the rain, the cold air hitting her like a wall. The parking lot was empty. Her car was gone, and so was the gas station. She turned in circles, panic clawing at her chest. The field she stood in stretched endlessly in every direction, the ground muddy and dotted with strange, withered plants. Behind her, a low, guttural growl echoed through the air. Emily turned, and her blood ran cold. The creature was there, its many mouths grinning, its clawed hand outstretched as it pointed toward her. "You'll see," it rasped, mimicking the voice of the man from the store. And then it charged. The storm had come out of nowhere. A ferocious downpour accompanied by deafening thunder and lightning that lit up the desolate road like the flash of a camera. Adam squinted through the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up with the deluge. He was miles from the nearest town, and his fuel gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty. Then, like an oasis in the storm, he saw it, a gas station glowing faintly in the distance. The sign, partially obscured by rain, read, "Wayfarer Fuel, since 1927. Adam pulled into the lot, the crunch of gravel barely audible over the pounding rain. The station seemed ancient, its peeling paint and sagging roof giving it the air of a relic that should have crumbled long ago. Still, the lights were on and the pumps looked functional. He grabbed his jacket and dashed inside, eager to escape the storm. The door creaked as it opened, and a faint bell jingled somewhere deep in the store. The inside was unnervingly quiet. The shelves were lined with outdated products. Soda bottles with faded labels, canned goods stamped with long-past expiration dates, and dusty bags of chips. A strange smell lingered in the air, earthy and metallic, like wet soil mixed with rust. Behind the counter stood a man who barely seemed alive. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken, and his lips pulled into a thin, tight line. "Pump 3, Adam said, placing a 20 on the counter. The man didn't acknowledge him, his hollow eyes fixed on something distant. Adam cleared his throat. "Hey, I need gas." Slowly, the man's head turned, his movements stiff and deliberate. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, and it carried an eerie weight. "You shouldn't have stopped here." Adam frowned, his unease growing. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he slid the 20 back across the counter. "You won't need this." Before Adam could question him further, the lights flickered, casting the store into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the man was gone. Adam called out, but the store remained silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. A cold draft swept through the aisles, and he realized with a start that the door he had entered through was now wide open. He stepped outside, the rain falling in heavy sheets. The gas station's lot stretched into the darkness, but something about it felt wrong. The pumps looked older now, rusted and decayed, and the sign above the station flickered erratically. Adam hurried to his car, but the moment he reached it, he froze. His vehicle was covered in mud and scratches that hadn't been there before. The driver's side door hung open, and the interior was soaking wet, as if it had been abandoned in a swamp for years. Behind him, a sound broke through the rain, a low, guttural growl. He turned slowly, his heart pounding. At first, he saw nothing but the storm and the dark expanse of the lot. But then, something moved. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long and jointed in the wrong places. Its head tilted as it stepped into the dim light, revealing a face, or what should have been a face. Instead, it was a featureless void, a black abyss that seemed to draw in the light around it. Adam stumbled backward, his breath caught in his throat. The creature moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. He scrambled into his car, slamming the door shut. The engine sputtered, refusing to start. The thing was at the passenger window now, its void-like face pressed against the glass. Then it whispered, a voice like wind through dead leaves. "You shouldn't have stopped." The glass cracked under the pressure of its touch, thin fissures spider-webbing outward. Adam screamed, turning the key frantically. The engine roared to life, deaf, and he floored it, the tires spinning before gripping the gravel. He sped away, the gas station disappearing into the storm behind him. But the road didn't feel right. It stretched on endlessly, the trees on either side twisting and contorting unnaturally. The radio crackled and a voice came through, soft and mocking. "You're not going anywhere." His headlights flickered, and when they came back on, The creature was in the middle of the road, standing perfectly still. Adam swerved, his car spinning out of control and slamming into a ditch. When he looked up, dazed and bleeding, the thing was standing at his window again, its void-like face inches from his. "You shouldn't have stopped," it repeated. Then everything went black. When Adam woke, he was back at the gas station. His car sat in the lot, pristine and untouched. The pumps gleamed as if freshly polished, and the storm had vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. But something was different. His reflection in the store's window wasn't his own. It was the clerk's hollow-eyed stare, his thin-lipped smile, and it was moving, even though Adam was perfectly still. The forest-lined highway stretched endlessly before Sophia, her headlights carving narrow paths through the dense, suffocating darkness. She hadn't passed another car in hours, and the clock on the dashboard seemed stuck at 3:33 a.m. A creeping sense of unease grew stronger with every mile, amplified by the low hum of her nearly empty gas tank. When she spotted the glow of a gas station up ahead, relief swept over her. The sign above the pumps read, "Eternal Rest, Open Forever," the letters flickering faintly in the still air. The place was eerily pristine. The pumps were shiny and new, the convenience store's windows gleamed, and the neon lights buzzed with an unnatural rhythm. Yet there was something unsettling about it. Too perfect, too out of place in the remote wilderness. Sophia pulled up to the pump and got out, her boots crunching on the gravel. The air was thick and heavy, as though the forest was holding its breath. She glanced toward the store, expecting to see an attendant inside, but the windows reflected only the glow of the neon sign. She lifted the pump nozzle, but the handle wouldn't budge. A sign above read, "Come inside first." With a sigh, she walked to the entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss, releasing a burst of cold air that smelled faintly of earth and mildew. The store was immaculate, yet wrong in ways she couldn't quite place. The shelves were lined with strange items, bottles filled with black, syrupy liquid, candy bars in unrecognizable wrappers, and a freezer stocked with meat that had no labels or visible packaging. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like he'd been carved out of wax. His skin was smooth and pale, his eyes large and unblinking. He smiled as she approached, but the expression didn't touch his eyes. "Pump 3, Sophia said, placing a credit card on the counter. The man didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on her, his smile unwavering. "Cash or card?" she asked, her voice breaking the thick silence. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a hollow whisper. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me?" The man leaned forward slightly, his movements stiff and unnatural. "It's too late now." Before she could respond, the lights flickered, plunging the store into brief darkness. When they came back on, the man was gone. Sophia's blood ran cold. She spun around, scanning the store, but there was no sign of him. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers drifted through the aisles. The automatic doors opened and closed on their own, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. Something brushed past her, though no one was there. Panicking, she ran back outside to her car. The pumps now looked different, older, covered in rust, with hoses that dangled limply like the limbs of a forgotten puppet. She jumped into her car and tried the ignition, but the engine refused to start. A low, guttural sound came from the woods surrounding the station. Her breath caught as she saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the shadows between the trees. They moved closer, slow and deliberate, revealing twisted shapes that barely resembled human figures. Sophia locked the doors, her hands trembling as she frantically pressed the ignition button again and again. The radio crackled to life, filling the car with static. Amid the white noise, a voice whispered, distorted and chilling. "We've been waiting." The headlights flickered, and the shapes in the woods became clearer. They were humanoid, but their limbs were elongated, their faces featureless except for gaping mouths that stretched impossibly wide. The engine roared to life, and Sophia didn't hesitate. She floored the gas, the car lurching forward as the creatures surged toward her. She sped down the road, the gas station disappearing in her rearview mirror. But as she drove, the same glowing sign appeared ahead of her, its flickering letters now reading, "No escape." Her heart pounded as she realized the road was looping. The gas station reappeared again and again, unchanged, as though it were tethered to her. The creatures were waiting each time, closer than before, their mouths stretching into soundless screams. Sophia slammed on the brakes, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She could feel their presence all around her now, pressing against the windows, whispering in her ears. The last thing she saw was the man from the counter, standing in the middle of the road, his unblinking eyes staring directly into hers. "You're one of us now," he said, and the darkness swallowed her whole. The hum of the engine was the only sound as Marcus drove down the lonely highway, his GPS stubbornly refusing to find a signal. The road was a narrow ribbon winding through the endless desert, illuminated only by the weak glow of his headlights. His gas gauge was dipping precariously toward empty, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. When the flickering sign of a gas station appeared in the distance, Marcus exhaled in relief. The sign read, "Nightshade Fuel, always open." The words shimmered faintly, like they didn't want to stay still. The station was an old relic, its pumps rusted and tilted slightly to one side. The convenience store was a squat, windowless building with a single door glowing under a buzzing fluorescent light. He pulled into the lot, the tires crunching on loose gravel. The pump didn't work. A faded piece of paper was taped to it. "Pay inside first." Marcus groaned and headed toward the store. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and a faint bell tinkled somewhere overhead. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of oil and decay. The shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty, outdated products, soda bottles that looked decades old, candy bars with faded packaging, and jars filled with what appeared to be pickled something. The counter was empty. He waited for a moment, tapping his foot, but no one appeared. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. He rang the small bell on the counter. The sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing around the store like it had nowhere to go. Then, from the back of the store, he heard a faint shuffling noise. It was slow and deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was back there didn't want to be seen. Marcus leaned over the counter, trying to peer through the beaded curtain separating the main store from the back. "Hey, I just need to pay for some gas." The shuffling stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was oppressive, almost as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Then a voice rasped from behind the curtain, low and cracked, like dry leaves scraping against each other. "You shouldn't have stopped here." Marcus froze, his stomach knotting. "What do you mean?" The curtain parted slightly, and a hand entered. It was gray and gnarled. The skin stretched tight over jagged bones, with nails that were long and yellowed. It held out a single, rusted key. "For the pump," the voice said. The hand didn't move, trembling slightly in the flickering light. Marcus hesitated before reaching out to take the key. The hand lingered for a moment too long, its claw-like fingers brushing his palm before retreating into the shadows. "Thanks," he said, his voice trailing off. He turned quickly and left the store, his heart pounding in his chest. Back at the pump, he slid the key into the lock. It turned with a groan, and gas began to flow. As the tank filled, Marcus glanced back at the store. The fluorescent light above the door was flickering more erratically now, and he thought he saw movement inside, shadows twisting and writhing against the walls. The pump clicked, signaling that the tank was full. He replaced the nozzle, tossed the key onto the ground, and climbed into his car. The engine sputtered to life, and he peeled out of the lot, eager to put as much distance as possible between him and that place. But as he drove, a strange sensation crept over him. The road seemed different. The desert, once barren and flat, was now lined with dark, jagged shapes that loomed on either side like skeletal trees. The stars above were obscured, replaced by swirling, shifting clouds of darkness. Marcus's chest tightened as the gas station's sign appeared in the distance again. Nightshade Fuel. Always open. The same rusted pumps, the same squat building, the same flickering light. He slammed on the brakes, his tires skidding on the loose gravel. "No way," he muttered. He turned the car around, driving in the opposite direction as fast as he could. Minutes later, the sign appeared again, glowing faintly in the darkness. The gas station was waiting unchanged, as if he'd never left. Panic set in. He stepped on the gas, pushing his car to its limits. The landscape grew darker, the shapes on either side of the road shifting and closing in, their outlines grotesque and wrong. And then he saw them, figures in the road ahead. They were tall and thin, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces blank voids. They moved slowly but deliberately, stepping closer and closer to the middle of the road. Marcus swerved, narrowly avoiding them. His car skidded off the road, crashing into the rocky terrain. The engine stalled and the headlights flickered and died. In the sudden, suffocating darkness, he heard the shuffling again. It was closer this time, accompanied by low, guttural whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then came the voice, the same raspy tone from the store, but now it was all around him. "You belong to the night now." The figures surrounded the car, their void-like faces pressing against the glass. Marcus screamed as the windows began to crack, spider-webbing under the pressure. The last thing he saw, before the darkness consumed him, was the gas station sign flickering once more. This time, the letters had rearranged themselves.
"No escape!